So, um, imagine you're just standing in a quiet field in the middle of the Midwest, right? You're digging into the earth, and you suddenly unearth this massive, beautiful ceremonial blade.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and you brush away the dirt, and you realize it's made of pure obsidian. But here's the catch. You are standing in the middle of Ohio, and that specific type of volcanic glass, it came all the way from Yellowstone National Park.
Which is what, thousands of miles away?
Exactly. Moved entirely on foot,
That is-
thousands of years before the invention of the wheel in North America. That is the real Ohio.
it really completely shatters that modern assumption we all have, doesn't it? I mean, we tend to use Ohio as this, demographic shorthand today.
Oh, totally. A flyover state.
Right, just a flat piece of geography that we only really check in on during election years to take the temperature of the country.
Which is exactly why we are doing this custom-tailored deep dive just for you today. We are pulling from a massive, comprehensive source text. It's simply titled The History of Ohio. And our mission here is to just peel back that predictable modern veneer.
Because when you actually dig into this material, you realize Ohio isn't just a piece of America. It's really the ultimate microcosm of the entire continent.
Right. We are going to explore this ancient, bustling trade empire, a deeply contested frontier, the industrial engine that, quite literally built the modern world, and also a perfect and sometimes really uncomfortable mirror of the nation's deepest ideological divides.
It provides the perfect blueprint, honestly. If you want to understand how the United States was built, how it fought with itself, and how it grew into a global superpower, you just have to look at the soil of Ohio. The patterns established there, they echo across the entire trajectory of the nation.
And to see those patterns, we have to go way, way back. Because the story here doesn't start with, European settlers in powdered wigs.
No, not at all.
It starts by proving that this specific region has always been a massively connected center of commerce. Our source notes human presence going back to, get this, 14,500 BCE.
That is incredibly early.
Right. Where prehistoric humans were hunting massive Jefferson's ground sloths with stone tools. But the real societal complexity, the stuff that just leaves you speechless, that begins with the mound builders.
Yes, the successive cultures known as the Adena, the Hopewell, and the Fort Ancient peoples. I mean,
Yeah.
they were not just nomadic hunter-gatherers passing through the region. They were highly sophisticated engineers who were fundamentally altering the landscape.
Right. They built these massive earthworks. Like, if you've ever seen aerial photos of the Great Serpent Mound in Adams County, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a giant undulating effigy of a serpent just carved right into the earth.
It's stunning.
It is. But they weren't just building localized monuments or like small burial plots. They were excavating these earth-walled enclosures that spanned up to 100 acres.
100 acres. Think about the labor involved in that.
Exactly. At their peak, the Hopewell settlements were essentially dense, ancient cities housing thousands of residents.
And what truly illustrates the sophistication of these cities is, well, it's the archaeological evidence of their trade networks. When we look inside these mounds, we don't just find local timber and stone.
Right, like the obsidian from Yellowstone I mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The reach is staggering. I mean, there is copper sourced from the Great Lakes. There is decorative mica that was mined from the Appalachian Mountains.
Wow.
And there are ornaments crafted from shark teeth and conch shells brought all the way up from the Gulf of Mexico.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there because the logistics of this are literally hurting my brain.
It's a lot to process.
How are they moving thousands of pounds of copper and obsidian across the North American continent without horses, without beasts of burden, and without wheeled carts?
It comes down to geography, specifically the rivers. The Ohio River and its massive network of tributaries, they functioned essentially as a prehistoric superhighway.
Oh, of course, the rivers.
Right. You didn't need a wheel when you had this deeply interconnected water system that allowed you to navigate canoes from the Great Lakes down to the Mississippi River and then eventually all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The geography basically made Ohio a natural, unavoidable bottleneck for continental trade.
Okay, let's unpack this. So it's less like an ancient Amazon distribution network where things are just magically shipped around, and more of a highly strategic port authority controlling the major waterways of the continent.
That's a great way to put it, actually.
But looking at the text, it seems like the very river networks that allowed the Hopewell to build this continent-wide trade empire, those became the exact highways that European powers later used to just tear it down.
Yeah, that is the tragic irony of the region's geography. What makes a place fantastic for trade also makes it highly, highly vulnerable to invasion. So if we fast forward to the 1650s, we arrive at the Beaver Wars. This is where European global politics, specifically the intense economic rivalries between the French, the British, and the Dutch, essentially turned the Ohio region into the site of a brutal proxy war. And this is long before America was even a concept.
Let's walk through the mechanics of how that actually happened, because the source text gets incredibly dark here. You have the Iroquois Confederacy, who were based further east in what is now, New York.
Correct.
And they had essentially hunted their local beaver populations to extinction for the European fur trade. But crucially, they were being armed with sophisticated modern firearms by Dutch and English traders.
And this creates a devastating ripple effect. I mean, the Iroquois have modern weapons, but they desperately need new hunting grounds to maintain their economic power with the Europeans.
Because the furs were their leverage.
Exactly. So they use those very same river networks we just talked about to launch a brutal mechanized campaign westward, right into the Ohio region to control the fur trade.
And they nearly exterminated the Huron and the Erie peoples who had lived in the Ohio region for generations.
It was one of the bloodiest, most destabilizing conflicts in North American history. The introduction of firearms into an existing indigenous trade network, it just completely reshaped the tribal map of the continent.
That wiped it clean.
Entire confederacies were destroyed or assimilated or forced to flee as far west as Minnesota or even as far south as the Carolinas.
So you have this land that was an ancient, thriving hub of interconnected cities, and because of European economic demands, it becomes this violently contested, deeply destabilized territory.
Yes.
And reading further into the source, it seems like that brutal reshaping during the Beaver Wars and subsequently the French and Indian War is exactly what created a vacuum. It made Ohio the prime, deeply contested target for a brand new nation looking to expand westward.
Precisely. After the American Revolution, the newly formed United States had a massive problem. They had absolutely no money.
Right, they were broke.
But they had thousands of heavily armed veterans who needed to be paid for their service in the war. So the government solution was to pay them in land, specifically land in the Ohio country, organized under the Northwest Ordinance.
Which brings us to Rufus Putnam, a guy known as the Father of Ohio. He was George Washington's chief military engineer during the Revolutionary War.
A brilliant engineer.
Yeah, the text points out he was a genius at building portable, modular fortifications to outsmart the British. So after the war, he takes that exact same engineering mindset and leads the first group of veterans to settle Marietta, Ohio in 1788.
And he knew what he was walking into.
Right, because he knows they're moving into highly contested, dangerous territory. He doesn't just pitch a few tents. He immediately builds a massive, heavily fortified structure called Campus Martius.
But the true genius of Putnam and his associate, Manasseh Cutler, wasn't just in how they engineered the physical settlements. It was how they engineered the legal framework of the territory.
This is the part that really blew my mind.
Yeah, they were Puritans from New England, and before they agreed to move, they insisted on a crucial clause in the Northwest Ordinance. The entire territory had to be fundamentally legally free of slavery.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you listening. You're probably thinking the Civil War was decided at Gettysburg or Fort Sumter, but looking at this source text, you could argue it was actually decided in 1788 in a wooden fort in Marietta.
You really could.
I mean, didn't this one single legal decision basically predetermine the winner of a war that wouldn't happen for another 70 years?
It absolutely did. If we connect this to the bigger picture, think about the mechanical impact of that clause. By mandating that Ohio and the subsequent states carved out of that Northwest territory, states like Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, by mandating they be free states, Putnam and Cutler fundamentally tilted the future balance of power in the United States.
Because of the Electoral College and congressional representation.
Exactly. If those states had permitted slavery, their agricultural and political systems would have aligned with the South. Their electoral votes would have gone to pro-slavery candidates.
Wow. So Lincoln might not have even been a factor.
Abraham Lincoln never would have had the electoral math required to win the presidency. And more importantly, the North never would have developed the immense specialized industrial capacity and the massive free labor population base it needed to physically defeat the Confederacy.
That is wild.
That single legal condition in Ohio's foundational blueprint arguably saved the Union decades before a shot was ever fired.
But we have to be incredibly clear with you here. Establishing that blueprint was not a peaceful democratic transition.
No, not at all.
The American push into Ohio was driven by economic desperation, and it resulted in horrific violence. The U.S. government needed that land to pay its debts, and they cleared it forcefully. The source specifically details atrocities like the Gnadenhutten Massacre of 1782.
Right, where U.S. militiamen systematically murdered 96 peaceful Christian Native Americans.
It's just devastating to read. And the indigenous resistance to this expansion was incredibly organized. You have Tecumseh's War, where the visionary Shawnee leader built a massive confederacy to halt American expansion.
Because he realized that no single tribe could fight the U.S. alone.
Exactly. He eventually allied with the British during the War of 1812, which led to massive regional conflicts like the Battle of Lake Erie.
But the ultimate result of that push and pull was the tragedy of the Indian Removal Act. The U.S. government forcefully pushed the remaining tribes out of Ohio entirely, culminating with the Wyandot being forced to leave their ancestral lands in 1843.
So the territory was violently secured. But once it was secured, the transformation of the landscape is almost hard to comprehend. We moved from pioneer survivalism and frontier forts to an industrial titanhood that literally built the physical infrastructure of the 20th century.
And it comes back to the mechanism of geography. Ohio possessed a perfect storm of natural resources and strategic positioning. In the early 19th century, the state aggressively built out its infrastructure to exploit that geography. They built the national road connecting them directly to the East Coast. They dug the Ohio and Erie Canal,
Which changed everything.
Suddenly, Ohio's massive deposits of coal, iron ore, and timber could be moved efficiently to global markets via the Great Lakes to the north and the Ohio River to the south. And then, of course, the railroads arrived.
The infrastructure boom is just staggering. You look at the mid to late 19th century, and the state essentially compartmentalizes into these massive industrial monopolies.
Oh, yeah. Completely specialized cities.
Like Cincinnati, because of its access to the rivers and the surrounding cornfields used for feed, becomes such a massive meatpacking hub, it is literally known as Porkopolis.
Porkopolis. I always love that detail.
Right. And up north, Cleveland leverages its access to the Great Lakes and the rail lines to birth Standard Oil, making John D. Rockefeller the world's first billionaire.
And then you have Akron.
Yes. Akron leverages its access to water and the transition from horse-drawn carriages to early automobiles to give birth to the global rubber industry with companies like Goodyear and Firestone.
And because of all this concentrated wealth and the sheer volume of raw materials flowing through the state, Ohio became an unparalleled center for innovation. It wasn't just producing heavy materials. It was breeding world-changing ideas.
Right, but I want to make sure we don't just rely on the cliche Silicon Valley metaphor here, because it's actually much more interesting than that. It wasn't just a bunch of isolated geniuses having light bulb moments.
Right, it wasn't a vacuum.
It was an ecosystem. When you have an environment overflowing with steel, rubber, oil, and the engineers required to process them, you naturally breed a secondary market of inventors who are trying to solve logistical problems for those massive industries.
That is the crucial distinction. The innovation was a direct byproduct of the industrial density. Take the Wright brothers, for example.
Oh, this is a great example.
Right. Why did the first airplane get invented in a Dayton bicycle shop and not by a heavily funded government laboratory in Europe?
Because making bicycles required an intimate understanding of lightweight metal tubular frames, sprockets, chains, and aerodynamic balance, which are the exact mechanical components required to build a flying machine.
Precisely.
They had access to those materials and that specific manufacturing knowledge precisely because they were sitting right in the middle of Ohio's industrial boom.
Exactly. And you see that same mechanical cross-pollination everywhere. You have Garrett Morgan in Cleveland inventing the traffic light.
Which makes perfect sense when you think about it.
Why? Because the streets of Cleveland were suddenly chaotic, dangerous intersections of streetcars, horse-drawn wagons, pedestrians, and early automobiles. It was a direct result of the city's rapid industrialization.
And then there's Albert Sabin developing the oral polio vaccine at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Even the invention of Play-Doh.
Oh, the Play-Doh story is fascinating.
It started out as a compound used to clean coal soot off of wallpaper. right? Because literally everyone was burning Ohio coal to heat their home.
That's exactly right.
It's all connected. But all of this industry required immense amounts of human labor, which triggered a massive demographic collision.
The factories needed workers, and that pull created a demographic crash course. You had massive waves of European immigrants, Irish, German, and Eastern European, pouring into the cities to work in the factories.
Right.
You had rural workers from the Appalachian Mountains relocating north to work in the rubber and steel plants. And you had thousands of African Americans arriving during the Great Migration, moving up from the Deep South to escape Jim Crow laws and find industrial work.
So Ohio effectively crammed all of America's cultural, racial, and economic dynamics into one state's borders. It created a uniquely diverse, rapidly urbanizing middle class.
Which brings us to the inevitable result of cramming all those different people, all that unprecedented economic power, and all those differing ideologies into one place. It turned Ohio into the ultimate political battleground.
It became the political microcosm of the United States.
Yeah.
And the most glaring example of this is Ohio's historical nickname, the Mother of Presidents. The state has sent 7 men to the White House.
7. That is a huge concentration of power.
And what's fascinating isn't just the number, it's the specific political logic behind why they were chosen. The source text explains that during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at these deadlocked, highly fractured political conventions, party leaders would desperately look for what they called an available candidate.
Ah, right. The available man.
Basically, a moderate compromise. Because Ohio was this perfect demographic microcosm, perfectly balanced between the north, south, east, and west, both industrially and agriculturally. The logic was simple. If a candidate is moderate enough to navigate the complex, diverse politics of Ohio, they can win the entire country.
But being a microcosm of America doesn't mean being entirely harmonious. In fact, reflecting America means accurately reflecting its deepest frictions, contradictions, and, rebellions.
Oh, definitely.
For instance, the fierce independence of the state was tested very early on. Let's look at the Rebellion of 1820.
Yes, okay. I need you to explain the mechanics of this to me because it sounds wild. The text says the Ohio legislature legally nullified federal court orders against the Bank of the United States. How does a single state just openly defy the federal government like that?
It was a direct, aggressive challenge to federal authority. Following a major financial panic, Ohio felt the Federal Bank of the United States was predatory.
Okay.
So the state legislature passed a law levying a massive, crippling tax on the federal bank branches located in Ohio. When the federal courts ordered them not to collect it, Ohio simply ignored the courts. They literally sent a state auditor into the federal bank vaults to seize the money by force.
Wait. They just walked in and took the cash to pay the state tax?
Literally walked in and took it.
That is insane.
And while the Supreme Court eventually ruled against Ohio in the landmark case Osborne v. Bank of the U.S., ordering the state to return the money, that event birthed a very strong, lingering tradition of state sovereignty in Ohio. It proved the state was willing to enforce its own will, even against the highest federal authorities.
And you see those incredibly sharp ideological contrasts playing out in almost every era. And just to be clear with you listening, we are strictly reporting the historical facts from our source text here to show these contrasts. We aren't taking sides on these historical movements, just showing how wild the swings were.
Right, we're just looking at the historical record.
Exactly. So we noted earlier that Ohio was a fierce anti-slavery state. It was a massive, highly organized hub for the Underground Railroad. Later, it became the birthplace of major progressive-era labor reforms.
Yes.
Our source notes it was a cradle for the social gospel movement. That was a movement that applied Christian ethics directly to social problems, fighting aggressively for workers' compensation and strict child labor laws to protect people from the very industrial machine Ohio had built.
Yet, simultaneously, we must look at the full historical record as presented in our source, which requires us to look at the pendulum swinging in the exact opposite direction.
Right.
Despite its progressive labor history in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan held immense political power and huge membership numbers within the state. They capitalized heavily on anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment in those rapidly changing industrial cities.
And then the pendulum swings again during the Cold War era of the 1950s. The political climate in the state swung heavily into a right-wing, anti-communist fervor. The state formed the Ohio Un-American Activities Committee specifically to root out suspected communists from public life.
The mechanism of that committee was incredibly invasive. The state government forced its employees to sign strict loyalty oaths just to receive a paycheck, swearing they were not part of any subversive organization.
Just to get paid.
Exactly. And they didn't just target government bureaucrats. They forced these oaths on university professors, researchers, and even Holocaust survivors who had settled in Ohio after World War II. It illustrates the intense paranoia of the era.
So you have the birthplace of the social gospel movement fighting for the poor on one hand, and a government hunting for communist sympathizers and forcing loyalty oaths on the other. It's dizzying.
It really is.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? If Ohio is the mirror for America, it seems like it's reflecting a country that is constantly pulling itself in two completely different directions.
This raises an important question, really, about identity, both for Ohio and for the United States as a whole. Ohio's legacy isn't just one monolithic, easily defined thing.
Right.
Its legacy is the friction itself. It's the tension between the progressive movement and the KKK, between radical abolitionists and Cold War paranoia. It's the whiplash between being the absolute pinnacle of industrial titanhood and suffering the devastating Rust Belt job losses of the modern era. That constant, grinding internal friction is exactly why Ohio remains a bellwether for the American political soul today. It embodies all of the competing contradictions of the entire nation, all trapped within one state's borders.
And that is why the next time you hear someone mention Ohio, or you see that familiar, seemingly predictable shape on a map, you shouldn't just think of a flyover state.
Definitely not.
You are looking at the ancient trade routes that connected a continent without a single wheel. You are looking at the legal blueprint of free states that saved the Union decades before the Civil War began. You are looking at the invention factories that literally forged the physical and mechanical infrastructure of the 20th century, and the intense, deeply complicated political battles that continue to define the nation today.
It really is a profound, layered legacy. And to leave you with one final fascinating historical mystery, to ponder something that reminds us of how much history is still buried beneath that Ohio soil, waiting to be understood.
Oh, I love a good mystery.
We talked earlier about the ancient mound builders and their complex cities. According to the source text, long before European crops ever arrived, prehistoric Ohioans developed what archaeologists call the Eastern Agricultural Complex.
Right, they weren't just foraging. They were selectively domesticating their own local plants for a reliable food supply.
Exactly. They successfully engineered and domesticated local crops like quinoa, little barley grass, and the specific, rare type of wild squash. They built a thriving, complex civilization largely on the back of this stable food supply.
Okay.
But for totally unknown reasons, once a specific new crop corn was introduced to the region from the south, these ancient people let all of those carefully domesticated foundational crops go entirely extinct.
Wait, they didn't just transition to corn. They let the crops they spent generations domesticating completely die out.
They dropped their entire foundational food supply. From an archaeological standpoint, why would a highly sophisticated society completely abandon generations of agricultural engineering just because a single new crop arrived?
That makes no sense.
Right. It's a massive unsolved puzzle of human behavior.
It just goes to show you, underneath the predictable surface of the map, the landscape is still murky, deeply complex, and full of secrets waiting for you to dig deeper.